O divine lady Focalors, god of justice, Regina of all waters, kindreds, peoples, and laws, the sole individual on Teyvat who could be simultaneously dubbed as both the greatest and most useless Archon in history. Just how much do I have to say about you? Well, a lot. From the death of the original Hydro Sovereign, to the creation of Egeria by the God of Life, to the birth of the Oceanids and the rise and fall of the Remurian Empire, all the way to the destruction of one of the 7 divine thrones of Celestia. Yeah, the answer is we've got a lot to talk about. So, let's start talking. I'm quite certain at this point that it is safe to say that Masquerade of the Guilty is the most significant of all the main quest lines in Genshin up until now. And you know what? I realized that this Archon Quest was overabundant with tremendously valuable details and information regarding the structure of Teyvat while also providing context behind significant factions at play. And yes, I know that Nouvelette's character story reveals what is easily the most vital lore bomb in the history of the game. And I promise you we'll get to those in time. However, let us leave them aside for now, because when we put Masquerade of the Guilty into perspective, we just witnessed right in front of our eyes what is definitively one of the most impactful historic events: the destruction of one of Celestia's 7 thrones at the hands of one of their own, and the surrendering of its authority back to the dragons. Now, I don't know about you, but I highly doubt that the King of Heaven appreciates treason. However, here's the problem. Who is there left to punish? After all, the traitor is already dead, her people's sins cleansed, rendering the 7 as the 6. 6. Speaking of number 6, remember all the way back in Mondstadt after saving Dvalin, the Traveler goes with Lisa on a quest to recover a fairy tale book stolen by the Abyss Order known as the Pale Princess and the 6 Pygmies, after which Lisa hands over the book to the Traveler. Friends, I'm gonna give you a hint. Keep this book in mind, I'm gonna come back to it later. Alright, to fully understand Focalors, who and what she is and all, we first need to understand her predecessor, the first Hydro Archon of the current era, Egeria. And to do that, I'm gonna have to take you on a journey to the distant past when the surface of Teyvat, and potentially the entire planet, according to Nouvelle, was covered by the first of the oceans known as the Primordial Sea. Now, in my previous videos, I speculated that the waters of the Primordial Sea belongs to the Light Realm, based on the various parallels it shares with the unaligned elemental energy known as Primal Light, which the Fontaine engineer Alain Guillotine further calls Primeval Energy. So, a while later, lo and behold, turns out that this is exactly the case, because from the description of the Wind Glider, Winds of Merciful Wrathful Waters, we learned that in the past, the beating heart of the Primordial Sea was the first Hydro Sovereign, who of course is one of the dragons of the Light Realm. Eventually, the beating heart was removed, after which the God of Life, who is one of the 4 shades of the King, created a new heart for the Primordial Sea, and it was a heart made from materials exclusively belonging to Teyvat. This distinction is important because both the God of Life and her King are aliens to Teyvat, thus the aforementioned statement implies that their creation, humanity, are by extension aliens as well. Regardless, that new heart was Egeria, who is said to have had the nobility of a dragon and the majesty of a god. And this brings us to a crucial point in the story: the birth of the Oceanids. Now, it is not actually clear when or how the Oceanids originated, yet some old notes the Traveler comes across in the ruins of the Fontaine Institute of Natural Philosophy give us some ideas to work with. For starters, we know that the ancient Oceanids were familiars of Egeria, and Egeria is stated to have felt both great sympathy for what had become of the dragons and great sorrow for the eventual fate of humanity. Thus did Egeria shed the first tear, which gave birth to the first Oceanids, from which all other Oceanids were born. Okay, here I need to point out that although it is said that Egeria created the Oceanids, the exact same source later goes on to dispute the validity of such claims, making the precise origins of the Oceanids unclear. Regardless, we still have some stuff to work with, because a statement that caught my attention from the ancient natural history excerpts reads, "The lizard's bones dissolved into mud, from which swans emerged." The person who recorded this line says that it is a metaphorical representation. And that is actually perfect for our case, because we can use what we know about Egeria to deduce the meaning behind the metaphor. So, Before the Primordial One, the world of Genshin Impact was governed by 7 dragon kings who served the ruler of the Light Realm, High King Nibelung, and one of those 7 was Nouvelette's predecessor, the first Hydra Sovereign. Now, the Oceanids of Genshin Impact are undisputably directly inspired by the Oceanids of Greek mythology, who were the 3,000 daughters of the Titan siblings Tethys, the goddess of freshwater, and Oceanus, who was in Greek mythology known as the Great Primordial River that sustained the world. This Greek Primordial River should immediately remind you of Teyvat's Primordial Sea, which likewise sustained Teyvat during its creation. And the heart of the Primordial Sea was the Dragon Sovereign of Water, whom at this point I wouldn't even be surprised if his name in Genshin was actually Oceanus. But what is even more interesting is that the goddess Egeria is said to have possessed a heart with nobility akin to that of a dragon. And as I said earlier, the god of life made Egeria as a replacement for the previous heart of the Primordial Sea, the Hydro Dragon Sovereign, after that heart was removed. Now, when the Hydro Dragon perished, it is likely that Egeria was made using his heart. However, I believe that we can all agree that after dying, the Hydro Dragon didn't just vanish out of thin air. In fact, if Apep is anything to go by, he must have left an enormous carcass behind. And here I want to bring you back to the metaphor. The lizard's bones dissolved into mud from which swans emerged. And yeah, at this point you probably understand what I'm about to say. Following the death of the Hydro Dragon Sovereign, the god of life extracted his heart and used it to make the goddess Egeria, the then new heart of the Primordial Sea. Eventually, Egeria felt sorrow for what had happened before her birth and shed a tear upon the bones of the Dragon of Water, dissolving them and forming the first Oceanids, who by the way were each and all females. This is clearly stated in the natural history excerpts, and from whom Egeria's own successor, the now deceased former Hydro Archon Focalors, would be amongst. One really cool detail that I want to point out is that notice how Nouvelle, the current Hydro Dragon Sovereign, was born right around the time of Egeria's death, who herself was the second heart of the Primordial Sea, meant to replace the first, and Nouvelette's ability to control the Primordial Sea is shown throughout the story, making it very obvious that he is the third and newest heart of the sea, until it is outright confirmed by him after Focalors hands over her authority to him. And once again, I really like this detail because you have the first heart, who was the Hydro Dragon, and then the second heart, Egeria, who is likely made from the heart of the first Hydro Dragon after his death, and then Nouvellette, the third heart, born right when the second died. Ironically, this is likely what the Shade of Life was trying to avoid when she created Egeria, preventing the reincarnation of the heart of the Primordial Sea as a dragon amongst the ranks of her enemies. Such a cool detail! But anyway, let's finish the story of Fontaine. Over time, some Oceanids grew jealous of humanity and desired to be like them and do the things that they could do. However, the forms that Oceanids take and create are mere mimicries of the life that they observe, and thus they could only mimic but never become that which they want. As ages passed, human civilization, which enjoyed enduring peace and prosperity and abundance under the rule of the heavenly envoys, grew dissatisfied with what they had and began to covet that which belonged to divinity. Mortal desires brought forth sin, and sin spread corruption throughout the lands until every thought of their hearts became evil. Then humanity, fueled by the smoldering flames of ambition, attempted to defy fate. Enraged by what had become of its creation, the Primordial One, the Holy King of Heaven, sent great floods to extinguish the fire of civilization on Earth. And so, humanity began anew. The Oceanids, who had long envied humanity, saw in this extinction a great opportunity. Thus, they begged the heart of the Primordial Sea to grant them human flesh, so that they may live as such. Yet the Queen of all Waters, in her great might, could not create true human life, for such authority belongs only to the King. So Egeria then gave the Oceanids humanoid bodies and injected their vessels with water from the Primordial Sea, allowing them to mimic humans. This act severely angered Celestia, who cursed them, promising that their nation would be destroyed by a great flood and all of its people dissolved back into the Primordial Sea. After which Egeria spoke of the prophecy of Fontaine, which was either divined by her, handed to her by Celestia, or handed to her by the visionary known as Vidurfolnir. It is currently unclear which is the true source. Fast forward thousands of years later, not long after the destruction of Gurabad, the armies of the god Remus reached the high waters and soon subdued and assimilated all of its scattered tribes into a single unified empire that became known as Remuria. Alright, the story of Remuria is both very long and extremely important, but for the sake of this video's length and for my own sanity, I won't be talking about it. And to be honest, it is not really relevant to what I'm going to say regarding Focalors anyway, but to give you a very brief rundown, here's what you need to know. Lemuria was a great empire ruled by a god named Remus, who was known as the player of the Grand Symphony. Remus had a divine goblet, which he could use to transform the waters of the primordial sea into golden ichor. He could also separate the soul from the body through various methods, and he did not like Egeria. Not in a hateful type of way, he just found her annoying. But alas, over time his empire collapsed from the inside out. Both Remus and his enemies were devoured by the abyss, after which Egeria, the sole surviving god in the high waters, ended up ascending to the position of Hydro-Archon and founded the nation of Fontaine. And then Khaenri'ah fell. Egeria died in the realm of Farachtat. Her consciousness was anchored in the mortal realm by Rukkhadevata as the Gaukrena lotus, forming the Rukasha oasis where the harvest of Tochen grew, which happens to be the god of the poppy. And then the Oceanid Focalors ascended to replace Egeria as the second Hydro-Archon, while inheriting every single goddamn problem that Egeria created during her lifetime. And man, honestly, when I think about it, I feel bad for Focalors, because Egeria died in Sumeru and left her behind a very, very messy room to clean up, to say the least. And this brings us to the modern era of Fontaine. Fueled by the prophecy of Fontaine's original sin and the impending apocalypse, two important figures rose to take action and attempt to prevent the eventual destruction of Fontaine. The first being Jakob Baker, a former orphan from the Narzissenkreuz Institute who established a cult known as the Narzissenkreuz Ordo, then used it as a distraction while he found a way to dissolve the consciousness of his friend Rhinedottir and combine it with the primordial sea, creating the mage Narzissenkreuz. But more on him in a different video, because for now, our main subject is the other figure who, unlike Jakob, ended up succeeding in saving Fontaine, and that is the now deceased second Hydro-Archon, Focalor. That being said, before I continue, I do want to point out yet another really cool detail that Hoyoverse put in the game. You know how I said both Jakob and Focalor started their journeys from the same point, but walked two completely different paths in pursuit of a similar goal? Well, just how ironic is it that in the end, despite one succeeding and the other failing, both of them died precisely similar deaths, with a giant blade falling on top of their heads and crushing them. I completed the Narzissenkreuz saga first and then did the Archon Quest and did not notice this. It wasn't only until I was recording this video that it clicked in my head, so yeah, well done to Genshin's writing team. Interestingly enough, Gold's real name is Rhinedottir, which means exactly what it sounds, the daughter of Rhine. This name refers to the three Rhine maidens from Wilhelm Richard Wagner's opera, The Ring of Nibelung, who are three beautiful nymphs guarding a golden treasure that gets stolen from them by a dwarf named Albrecht to forge a magical ring. Here, if we liken the three Rhine maidens to the three moon sisters, who were the goddesses of the Sealies, then Rhinedottir could potentially be an exceptionally powerful Sealie, just like the goddess of flowers that joined the people of Khaenri'ah in their pursuit to defy the heavenly principles. And since I mentioned the heavenly principles, Skirk says that Rhinedottir appears to be pursuing some kind of perfection, and I believe that this perfection has to do with her quest to create true life through chemia. Bodies that possess power from beyond this world, that can stand against the laws of the heavenly principles, the laws that cursed the people of Khaenri'ah and the Hilichurls. Anyway, let us now talk about the various things we learned from Focalors' actions and death during the Fontaine Archon Quest, because there are several huge details that I want to point out. And, you know what, since I was talking about Jakob just now, let's pull him back in for a couple of things. Focalors confirms that the people of Fontaine are all descendants of the first Oceanids that Egeria transformed into humans using the primordial sea, and that includes Jakob and Renee, which finally clarifies why the composition of their bodies is akin to that of the Gaukrena lotus that anchors Egeria's consciousness. But what is truly interesting is that this property is what allows Jakob to successfully transform into an abyssling when non-Fontainians like Carter fail. And it is a property that I reckon he shares with the members of the Abyss Order from Khaenri'ah. Now, I don't want to make any major conclusions, however we can utilize the information we obtained from the Fontaine Archon Quest series to great effect in order to speculate on what happened with the Khaenri'ahns. Remember that the Oceanids in Genshin are often referred to as nymphs. We have an entire artifact set known as Nymph's Dream, which directly states this. Here, I want to shift your attention back to the fact that Genshin's Oceanids are inspired by the 3,000 nymph daughters of the Titan Oceanus, the Greek Oceanids. Furthermore, nymphs in Greek mythology are minor divinities commonly associated with fairies. And, oh, guess what? there also happens to be another prominent species in Genshin Impact that is heavily associated with fairies. Well, hold on a second, I'll get to those. But before I do, let me make sure that we are all on the same page here. So, we know that the reason Jacob Baker could transform into an Abyssling is due to him being a descendant of Egeria's humanoid Oceanids. This by extension explains why the composition of his body resembles that of the Gaukrena lotus, which is the remains of the goddess Egeria. Additionally, the Wings of Merciful Wrathful Water said that the god of life created Egeria from materials native to Teyvat, emphasis on the word native. Considering that humanoid Oceanids like Jacob have the capacity to transform into Abysslings where other humans fail, then logic dictates that any other Abyssling would also not belong to a truly human race. However, they would not be Oceanids. After all, the vast majority of the Abyss Order is composed of former Khaenri'ahns who were relatively speaking unrelated to Fontaine. So, another common possibility that pops up to mind are Vishaps. And Vishaps, Vishaps are cool, but I don't think that this is the case right here for reasons that I will get into in a number of future videos. As for our current topic, well, Khaenri'ahns are not true humans indeed. They are in fact descendants of the Sealies. Yeah, I know. Listen, hear me out. During their time in Sumeru, the Traveler and Paimon come across these ruins right here. And these ruins have always annoyed me a lot. And let me tell you why. You see, if you pay close attention to their structure and design, you will notice that they are architecturally identical to several other ruins that can be found all over Teyvat, and are especially visible across Mondstadt and Inazuma. Some of them belong to extremely notable historical sites, such as the ancient civilizations of Salvindagnir and Tsurumi, which are infamous for their murals depicting interactions between what are presumably mortal kings and envoys of Celestia. Now, we know that Teyvat's first civilization was unified directly under the rule of the Primordial One, to which the Byakuyakoku once belonged, and that was an era of prosperity where heavenly envoys walked alongside mankind. Nonetheless, these ancient ruins cannot possibly belong to the first civilization due to two major factors. The first is that they simply look completely different, while the second is the fact that they are extremely topographically well preserved on the surface of Teyvat when compared to the cities of the First Era, which can be found buried deep beneath the earth in Enkanomia and the Chasm. So, to whom did these ruins belong exactly? Well, Kaveh mentions during his Hangout quest that architecture is more than just construction. It is a form of art and expression that, when done right, can immortalize the mind behind it long after their death. And oh boy, could his statement be more true than it is now. Going back to Sumeru, the Traveler is told by academia scholars that these ruins are known as the ruins of Dahri, where the word Dahri explicitly refers to none other than the Khaenri'ahns. But this makes no sense! How could these ruins possibly belong to Khaenri'ah? After all, we know quite well what Khaenri'ahn architecture and symbolism looks like, and it is distinct from what you can observe across the ruins of Dahri and its other identical ruins across Teyvat. In fact, if anything, Khaenri'ahns bear the closest resemblance to the ancient civilization of Deshret. Actually, more to that point, these ancient ruins are exposed everywhere from Sumeru's rainforest to Mondstadt, Liyue, and Inazuma. Meanwhile, when it comes to Khaenri'ah, we already have an approximate idea of where the nation is, based on the location and orientation of one of its gateways. And it obviously would not stretch from Sumeru to Inazuma. That would be logistically challenging and unrealistic. With that being said, there are two major locations where Dahri ruins can barely be found, those being the high waters of Fontaine and the deserts of Sumeru. The absence of such ruins in Fontaine can be attributed to the significant degree of natural and human influence terraforming and weathering that the surface was subjected to by various factors that I discussed earlier in this video. However, when it comes to Deshret's civilization, okay, I won't insult your intelligence and pretend like this is some kind of revolutionary revelation. Any individual with a functioning eyeball, get it, eyeball, can easily tell that the Khaenri'ahn octogram is pretty much a 90-degree flipped version of the Eye of Amun. And what's interesting about Amun is, well, there are a lot of things interesting about Amun. But I want to finish this point and get back to Focalors, so for the sake of time, let us ignore everything else and focus on the fact that his lover, Nabu Malikata, was a Seelie. cursed by Celestia. And since I'm on the topic of curses, the humanoid Oceanids were also a race cursed by Celestia as a punishment for their sins, just like the Sealies. If you take a closer look on the Dahri ruins, you will notice that they are profoundly similar in design to real-life Celtic architecture, and are inscribed with various Celtic symbols, including the Triquetra, the Daranad, the Tricyclion, and the Serchbithol, to name a few. And as many of you know, the word Seelie in of itself is a Scottish word that translates to fairy, which leads me to believe that this architectural style either directly belongs to or is heavily inspired by the ancient Seelies. Now, the nation of Khaenri'ah, based on its mythological inspirations and naming conventions, is undeniably inspired by Scandinavia. Oh, what a coincidence! Look what we have here! How convenient is it that the ancient civilization of Salvindagnir, one of the most prominent locations in the entire game where Dahri ruins can be found, also happens to be inspired by Nordic cultures. When the traveler talks with Nicole during Masquerade of the Guilty, the Hexenzirkel mage says the following.
The prophecy. Yes, what has been prophesied will be fulfilled. You may view such things as the history of the future.
History of the future, right. Well, thousands of years ago, before the mountain's demise, the princess of Vindagnir saw a prophecy of her own where she dreamt of a black dragon that blotted out the sun and knew it to be an omen of doom. With context, we know that this dragon is Durin, one of Rhinedottir's creations from Khaenri'ah. And the last surviving scribe of Vindagnir wrote before the mountain's death that he heard of people who are building a nation without gods, and said perhaps they will have the power to stand against this world. This gives us direct confirmation that the foundation of Khaenri'ah took place around the same time as the annihilation of the Dahri civilization of the face of Teyvat. But wait, there is more. When the traveler inquires Nicole on means to avert the prophecy, Nicole tells him,
just as prophecies are usually only the future as seen from the perspectives of the gods, could things be happening in hidden corners where the god's gaze does not fall?
Where have I heard this before?
In the perpetual meantime of a sheltered eternity, most are content to live and not to dream. But in the hidden corners where the god's gaze does not fall, there are those who dream of dreaming. Some say a few are chosen and the rest are dregs. But I say we humans have our humanity. We will defy this world with a power from beyond.
Hold on, it doesn't end here. I'm about to go even further. You see, we know for a fact that the Seelies were servants of Arya, Sonnet, and Kanon, the three goddesses of the moon that illuminated the night sky. Also notice how the Seelies in their spirit form eerily resemble what a baby Oceanid like Endora looks like. Here, keep in mind that Oceanids were created by Egeria, likely from the Hydro Sovereign's carcass, as I discussed earlier, while Egeria herself was created by the Shade of Life, likely from the heart of the Hydro Sovereign, using materials that belong exclusively to Teyvat. Even though her creator, the Shade of Life, was a god of humans who, just like her master and king, are aliens to Teyvat. Considering that Fontaine was cursed due to Egeria's original sin of attempting to replicate the authority of the divine by transforming her Oceans into a human-like race, then with all of the evidence I have provided, it isn't far-fetched for a nation of sinners to likewise consist of humans who lack true humanity, or to put it in terms that the primordial one wouldn't particularly appreciate, humans that are native to Teyvat. While we know that the Seelies were not necessarily gods, they were almost definitely godlike in nature. They were a species of envoys guiding humanity under the Moon Sisters, and Nabu Malikata, a single member of this species, albeit most likely an exceptionally powerful one, was strong enough that the blood from her wounds gave birth to an entire race of Jinn, each mighty by their own right. Yet just like the Oceanids, the Seelies were punished by heaven for their sins following the arrival of the second Descender, devolving into mere wisps across Teyvat. However, what if I told you that the Seelies were not completely annihilated? What if I told you that in order to avoid certain destruction, some of them were transformed into human forms by some powerful divinity, then proceeded to exile themselves from their stolen lands and depart into the hidden corners of the world where the gaze of their enemies does not fall. The desert seems like a perfect place to me. And what if I told you that in the smoldering sands these people met a mad god mightier than any other amongst his kin, who in his pursuit of wisdom became an outcast from heaven? Oh, what say you? He was in love with a Seelie, you say? His goals aligns with ours. Well, that's perfect. After all, who better fit to rule us, a people of outcasts, than an outcast king? Thus, a nation of divine beings who shunned the order of the usurper stood united, not as gods, but as humans under the banner of the eclipse, so that one day their moon may rise and block out the light of the usurper's sun. This not only explains why the Khaenri'ahns can turn into abysslings like Jacob Baker, but it also perfectly exemplifies why certain Khaenri'ahns such as Dainsleif and Pierro were cursed with immortality by the gods. Notice that the curse laid upon Dainsleif is extremely similar, if not identical, to the one that Focalors gave to Furina by separating her divinity from body and soul, then forcing the latter to live for centuries as a mortal that cannot die. A suffering that the innocent Furina had to endure for such a long, agonizing time, for a goal that she never knew when or even if would ever be realized. And endure she did. But in the end, her pain was met with justice, for the god Focalors would not allow for the innocent to suffer without balancing the scales, and there could only be one punishment sufficient enough for such an act of injustice. A god cannot truly die, they say. For when gods are killed, their remnants linger, giving rise to various other objects, life forms, and curses. This is unlike people who die when they are killed, by the way. And if neither she nor Egeria could cleanse the original sin, then Focalors knew that she must find the one who could, and return to him that which was taken by her king. Thus, she spent 500 years in hiding, harvesting enough indemnitium to power a nation for millennia, then using it to forge a weapon capable of executing her divine self and simultaneously destroying her throne in heaven and returning its authority to the Dragon of Water. To save her people, Focalors inflicted upon herself a most excruciating judgment, one that she fully undertook, body, mind, and soul, so that she may deceive the heavenly principles. Yet, in the end, she saw her sentence through and succeeded in every sense imaginable. In her death, she lifted the sin of the ancestors from their children, returned what is rightful to its owner, and dealt a lasting blow to the usurpers in the sky above. Such is the justice of Lady Focalors. Such is her resolve and strength of will. And here, I have to admit, after thinking about the magnitude of what she went through to achieve a complete and absolute justice for her people, Focalors might very well truly deserve to be dubbed as the greatest of the Archons. Who are no longer 7, by the way, they are now 6. And remember the book I mentioned earlier at the start of this video? That's right! The Pale Princess and the 6 Pygmies. Well, this book series consists of 8 parts, with part 1 being currently in possession of the Traveler, while the other 7 are unfortunately currently unreleased. So we are gonna have to work with what we have got. Which isn't a lot, but I can make something out of it. Look, I know that a lot of what I'm about to say is going to sound insane, but let me cook. During Lisa's story quest, the Abyss Mage who stole it mentions that the book contains a secret that is worthwhile for the Abyss to invest time into obtaining. The title itself is a play on an extremely iconic Germanic fairy tale that you 1000% heard of before, which is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Or if you are Disney in 2023, the Half-Colombian Princess and the Seven Diverse People. Yeah, look where that went. Anyway, to summarize Volume 1 of the book in Genshin, the story tells of the Night Mother, who rules over the faraway land of Night, which is full of sin and cruelty. But in this land, a single refuge known as the Moonlight Forest exists, where beautiful creatures with fair skin, light hair, and bright eyes lived. While not explicitly stated in Volume 1, the Pale Princess most likely belongs to the Moonlight Forest. The setting of the story should immediately remind you of the Seelies, who are not only heavily associated with the moon, but are also described to be fair-skinned and tremendously beautiful. And hopefully everything I have spoken about earlier in this video was enough to build a connection between Khaenri'ahns, Seelies, and the moon. Now, if Khaenri'ahns are indeed transformed Seelies just like Fontainians were Oceanids, then surely there must have been a god like Egeria that was involved in the process to some degree. And if you go back to what Nicole said in Masquerade of the Guilty about telling the history of the future in the past, then suddenly the 6 Archons being representations of the 6 Pygmies in the title makes a lot of sense, leaving the Pale Princess as the only rightful god of the Seelies, the progenitor of the godless nation of Khaenri'ah, who acknowledges no deity from the usurpers. But if the Archons are the Pygmies, then just who could be the Pale Princess? Who is the ruler of the Moonlight Forest?
So, don't take this the wrong way or anything, but, do you ever get tired of Paimon being around?
Your journey has reached its end, but one final doorway remains. Step forth if you have understood the meaning of your journey. Defeat me. Command me to step aside. Show me that you are worthier than I to rescue her. Then, the threads of all fate will be yours to reweave. My memory has all but faded completely, but I will always remember how much she too loved these flowers.
Using his reclaimed authority, Nubila was able to finally accomplish what even Egeria could not, releasing the people of Fontaine from their curse and transforming them into true humans, which interestingly enough is a feat that was previously thought to only be possible by 2 other, the Shade of Life and her king. A feat reserved only for a god, they say. Yet the one who was able to replicate it is not a god, but a dragon. A dragon creating true human life. I wonder what this implies about the primordial one. You know what? I will let you wonder about it too. Because for now, we have reached the end of this video. Normally around now, I'd be starting my outro, but for this video, I won't be doing one. Instead, I want to dedicate the last few minutes to talk about Furina. And yes, when I say Furina, I mean Furina, not Focalors. Our girl Furina is an interesting character to say the least, because she is the first playable character in the story to be portrayed as someone who is completely and utterly incompetent in combat, even though she held a high position of authority for 500 years in Fontaine, and ironically, as counterintuitive as this might sound, I believe that this was the perfect way to portray her. After all, Furina represents something that is far more nuanced than godhood and power and strength, and it is not something that easily appears on surface level. While doing her story quest, I felt really disappointed because I thought I was in for another garbage NPC simulator like Nilo and Yaimiko's story quests were, but as the story progressed, I quickly understood the meaning behind it. Furina's story quest discusses the process of having to deal with things that you do not like. Simple, useless, irrelevant human things. The challenge of confronting discomfort and the importance of breaking out of your comfort zone, metaphorically bursting your bubble, no pun intended. And as laughable and ridiculously simple as it sounds when I say it, I am pretty sure that I speak for everyone when I say that we've all had this one bad experience that took place at an unfortunate time, causing us to associate it with something that is not necessarily related to it, and by extension drives us to avoid that thing out of fear of potential discomfort or inconvenience. Furina takes this to the absolute extreme, as she has suffered having to play a role for all of her life throughout 500 years of history without stopping, to the point where she swore off of acting entirely once she was free. However, trying to hide from things that inconvenience us is not true freedom. It is merely cowardice wearing a different mask. And once Furina recognizes that and steps back onto the stage to take responsibility for facing her past, she turns something that she thought she hated into her very first, truly profound performance. Facing the hardships of life is an absolute must. To become stronger, you have to constantly overcome that which makes you hesitate. And this is illustrated masterfully when Furina turns a terrible memory of her long life of lies into a beautiful and true first experience born out of the ambition to tell a story that the people will remember. And how beautiful is it that the god Focalors, who desired nothing more than to one day become human, ended up returning her authority to the dragon Nouvellette, who in turn gave a shard of his power to honor the ambition of a human named Furina.